The sun was shining softly over the palace lawns that morning. The royal residence stood tall, quiet, and dignified, a place where history seemed to breathe through every stone wall and polished window. Inside, everything moved in a careful rhythm. Guards in their uniforms stood straight at the gates, servants walked silently through the hallways, and the sound of distant bells echoed through the royal corridors. It was a normal day on the outside, but behind the tall golden gates, a storm of emotions was slowly taking shape. For years, King Charles had lived a life where every moment was planned, every movement watched, and every word measured. His life was not just his own. It belonged to the crown, to the people, and to the long line of tradition that came before him. He understood this well, yet there were moments when he wished he could simply be Charles, not the king, not the figure in history books, just a man with a family. His marriage to Camilla had been a turning point in his life. It was more than just a royal event. It was a personal victory, a love story that had survived years of whispers, judgment, and countless headlines. Camilla had always been a calm presence in his world. She was someone who knew him not as a king but as a person. Through quiet conversations over tea, long walks in the gardens, and moments of shared laughter away from the cameras, they had built a bond that was both strong and gentle. And with Camilla came her family, people who were never meant to be part of the royal world, but who had found a place at the edges of it. Her family was not made of royalty, but they carried warmth and kindness. They were the kind of people who laughed loudly, shared stories over dinner, and brought a sense of ordinary life into the palace's polished, distant world. For Charles, their presence made the palace feel less like a cold monument and more like a home. At family gatherings, the king would often be seen sitting with them in a relaxed mood, not as a ruler, but as a husband, stepfather, and grandfather figure. He would smile more, talk freely, and allow himself to forget, even for a short while, the weight of the crown resting on his shoulders. But not everyone in the palace shared this view. In quiet corners and behind closed doors, some senior officials believed that the line between the royal family and outsiders was slowly becoming blurry. The Royal Guard, a group not only responsible for the king's safety but also for protecting the dignity of the monarchy, had begun to watch these gatherings with growing concern. They did not dislike Camilla's family personally. Their worries were about rules, traditions, and appearances. To them, the royal palace was not just a home. It was a symbol of the nation, and symbols had to remain untouched, controlled, and carefully managed. This unspoken tension had grown quietly over the months. No one dared speak of it openly, but it was there, in the sharp glances exchanged during events, in the whispered conversations after dinners, and in the formal reports prepared by security officers. Everyone knew that one day this quiet concern would become something bigger. Charles, however, remained unaware of the growing discomfort. He believed that with time, everyone would learn to accept the warmth Camilla's family brought. In his heart, he thought that love, kindness, and personal connections were stronger than the rigid walls of tradition. For a long time, that belief seemed to hold true. Each year, the royal calendar was filled with official ceremonies, grand banquets, state visits, charity events, and national celebrations. These were moments of perfect order where everything had to be precise. But Charles cherished the smaller, private occasions even more. He loved the afternoons in the palace garden when Camilla's grandchildren would run around, their laughter echoing through the air. He loved how Camilla's sister would tell amusing stories, making even the stiffest royal butlers crack a smile. These were the moments when the palace felt alive, not as a fortress but as a living, breathing home. But the palace is not like other homes. Every smile, every guest, and every gathering is quietly observed, noted, and judged. Royal advisors and guards are trained to think not only about today, but about the legacy of tomorrow. They worried that too much closeness with non-royal members might give the public or the press a reason to question the line between the royal family and ordinary society. They feared that it could open doors that should remain closed. The Royal Guard is more than just a team of protectors. They carry with them a code, a promise to keep the royal family safe not only from physical harm but from anything that could shake the structure of the monarchy. That includes the influence of outsiders, however kind or harmless they may seem. This sense of duty runs deep. Generations of guards have followed the same principles, unchanged through wars, celebrations, and royal transitions. To them, keeping that line clear is part of their very identity. Inside the palace, these discussions slowly reached the highest levels of decision-making. Reports were written in careful, formal language, filled with phrases like security protocol, institutional protection, and long-standing tradition. But beneath those words was a simple truth: the guards and advisors wanted Camilla's family to have less access to the palace. It was a delicate subject. No one wanted to upset the king. They knew how much his personal happiness depended on the warmth that Camilla's loved ones brought him. At the same time, they believed they were protecting something larger than any single person's feelings. So the tension remained like a quiet wind passing through the halls, unseen but strongly felt. Charles, meanwhile, continued with his daily duties. He attended meetings, signed documents, greeted foreign guests, and walked through the palace with his usual gentle smile. But the happiest moments were still the ones spent away from formalities, sitting with Camilla and their blended family, where titles disappeared and only laughter remained. Camilla understood the world she had married into. She knew that being queen consort meant more than standing beside the king at public events. It meant balancing two worlds, her personal life and the life demanded by the crown. Over the years, she had learned to keep many of her feelings quiet. But when she saw the guarded looks from some officials during family gatherings, she could sense the shift even before words were spoken. The palace staff had always shown respect to her family, but lately the smiles had grown tighter, the conversations shorter. It was as if an invisible wall was slowly being built around them. Camilla didn't want to alarm Charles with her worries, so she kept her feelings tucked away. She hoped it was just a passing phase, perhaps a misunderstanding, perhaps a matter of time. But time wasn't softening the atmosphere. It was sharpening it. Advisors were no longer whispering. They were preparing formal recommendations. They believed that if they didn't act, the line between personal affection and royal duty might blur too much. And so, in quiet rooms where heavy curtains blocked out the world, senior figures gathered to talk. They spoke in calm voices, but every word carried weight. Tradition must be protected, one said. We cannot allow emotional ties to weaken the structure, another added. Every person at that table believed they were doing the right thing. None of them thought of the heartbreak their decision might bring. While this was happening, Charles remained blissfully unaware of the exact details. He was the king, yet there were many conversations held around him, not with him. This was one of the strange truths of monarchy. Power did not always mean control. Decisions often moved through silent corridors long before they reached the royal ear. In the evenings, Charles and Camilla would sometimes sit near the window overlooking the gardens. The lights of the palace grounds glowed softly, and the air was filled with the distant sound of guards changing shifts. In these quiet moments, Charles felt most at peace. He didn't know that those very guards were discussing matters that would soon bring tears to his eyes. There was a kind of stillness in those days, the kind that comes right before something important happens. Everyone could sense it, the staff, the advisors, even Camilla. But no one spoke of it aloud. The palace continued its quiet routine. The gates opened and closed. The bells rang at their usual hour. But the balance between love and duty was slowly, silently shifting. This was the beginning of a story that would soon unfold in ways Charles never imagined. A simple family presence, something that once brought comfort and joy, was about to collide with centuries of royal tradition. The royal guard, loyal to the crown, was preparing to take a step they believed was necessary. But for Charles, that step would feel like a sudden, deep wound. And in that moment of calm before the storm, the king sat by the window, unaware that soon the palace he loved would no longer feel quite the same. The palace had always seemed like a world of shining lights and quiet power. Everything inside it was controlled, polished, and carefully planned. But in the background, something serious had started to unfold. What began as a few whispered conversations among senior officials was slowly turning into something much larger. The Royal Guard, the group that protected both the king and the crown's traditions, had taken their concerns to the highest level. They had spent weeks observing how Camilla's family had slowly become part of daily palace life. To many outside, it seemed sweet and simple, just a loving family gathering together. But the guard viewed it through a different lens. Their duty wasn't about personal emotions, It was about protecting the palace as an institution, and in their eyes, too much personal closeness with people outside the official royal circle could become a serious concern in the long term. Inside a quiet office tucked away in one of the oldest wings of the palace, a group of senior guards and advisors gathered one evening. The room was lit with warm lamps that made the heavy wood furniture glow softly. The walls were lined with old portraits of past monarchs, faces of kings and queens who had ruled with discipline and dignity. Their painted eyes seemed to watch every meeting held there, as if reminding those inside of their responsibility to protect the legacy. The main security officer cleared his throat. His voice was calm but carried a weight that made everyone in the room sit a little straighter. "This is not about disrespecting anyone," he said carefully. "This is about boundaries that should not be blurred." He then laid a set of neatly prepared papers on the table. On them were notes and reports, documenting small details: who had visited the palace when they had come, which rooms they had been allowed to access, and what events they had attended. None of it showed anything wrong, but to the guard these visits represented a line slowly being crossed. An advisor who had served the crown for decades spoke next. "His Majesty is a kind-hearted man," she said gently, "but kindness must not weaken the crown. If we allow too much personal closeness, tomorrow it may grow into something bigger. The palace must remain what it has always been, separate, strong, and sacred." The room fell silent after her words. No one wanted to be the one responsible for hurting the king's feelings. Everyone respected him deeply, but they were also trained to think of the monarchy as something bigger than one person's happiness. To them, protecting the palace meant sometimes making decisions that would cause personal pain. Outside the meeting room, the evening sky was slowly turning dark. The palace lights came on one by one, casting a golden glow over the lawns. In another wing of the building, Charles and Camilla were sitting together, sharing a quiet moment after a long day. Neither of them knew that, just a few halls away, people were preparing a decision that would soon change their private lives. Camilla laughed softly at something the king said. It was a warm, ordinary moment, the kind that made their relationship feel human despite the royal crown. The king leaned back, feeling a rare sense of peace. These were the moments he treasured most, when the palace felt like home, not a symbol. But peace in the palace often lived side by side with duty. That night, the royal guard's discussion stretched on for hours. They talked about every angle of the issue: how to keep traditions, how to maintain security, how to protect the king without making him feel betrayed. They also knew that such a step would not be received quietly. It would cause emotions. It would hurt the king deeply. The decision wasn't made lightly. After careful debate, they reached a final conclusion. Access for Camilla's family to certain palace privileges would be officially removed. This didn't mean they were banished from Charles's personal life, but it meant they would no longer be treated as part of the inner royal circle. This was a line the guard believed they had to draw, and they felt it was their duty to enforce it, even if it broke hearts along the way. The next morning, the sun rose gently over the gardens. Birds fluttered near the tall iron gates. Staff began their usual routines, unaware of the storm that was about to quietly begin. In the security office, the official order was typed out in formal language. The words were polite but firm, stating clearly that for the sake of tradition and institutional protection, Camilla's family would no longer have access to certain royal spaces and privileges. The paper was placed inside an envelope with a royal seal. It would soon be handed to the palace's senior private secretary, who would then deliver the news to the king himself. Meanwhile, Charles had started his day with the usual schedule: a few official briefings, a charity meeting, and a planned lunch with Camilla. He was in a calm mood, unaware that a piece of paper carrying painful news was already on its way to his office. Camilla was also unaware. She spent part of her morning on the phone with one of her family members, talking about an upcoming informal family gathering at the palace. It was meant to be something simple and warm, the kind of event that made the king smile. But fate had decided that the day would not unfold the way they imagined. Back in the guard's office, the senior officer gave the envelope a long look before handing it to a messenger. He wasn't a cold-hearted man. In fact, he respected the king deeply, but his loyalty was to the throne and the long line of monarchs who came before. For him, the decision was about duty, not emotion. The messenger walked through the long corridors of the palace, past portraits, chandeliers, and guards standing silently at their posts. The sound of his footsteps echoed softly against the marble floors. With each step, the envelope seemed to grow heavier, not because of its weight, but because of what it carried. Charles was sitting in his office when the knock came at the door. "Your Majesty," the private secretary said softly, stepping in. "There's something that requires your attention." The king's eyes, warm and kind as always, lifted from the papers on his desk. "What is it?" he asked. The envelope was placed gently before him. He noticed the seal immediately. It was official, formal, and unmistakable. With careful hands, he opened it and began to read. At first, the words didn't register fully. The language was polished, distant, and polite, the way official orders were always written. But as his eyes moved down the page, the meaning grew clearer with each line. Camilla's family, restricted access, protection of the crown, institutional distance. His hand paused halfway down the page. For a moment, the room felt quieter than usual. He read it again slowly, as if hoping the words would change. But they didn't. It wasn't just a decision. It was a message. The people who had always stood behind the royal walls, the guards, the advisors, the protectors, were drawing a line around him. And that line, for the first time in years, did not include the people he loved. The private secretary stood silently, understanding the weight of what was happening. "They believe it's necessary," he said carefully. "For the institution, Your Majesty." Charles leaned back slightly in his chair. His face remained calm, but inside something heavy began to settle in his chest. For all his life he had known what it meant to be part of the monarchy. He had learned early on that personal happiness often came second to tradition. But this was different. This wasn't about distant rules. This was about the people closest to him. Outside his office window, the gardens looked the same as they always did. The flowers bloomed, the guards marched, and the sky was a bright blue. But for Charles, something had changed. A wall that had once felt soft and open now felt cold and firm. Camilla was still unaware of the news as she prepared for lunch. She smiled when she saw Charles walking toward her later that day, not noticing the quiet weight behind his eyes. The king tried to keep his voice steady as they sat together. But deep inside, he knew that soon he would have to tell her something that would hurt her, something she didn't see coming. This was the moment the royal love story began to meet the hard edge of palace duty. One decision made in a quiet room was about to change the warmth of their world. And though Charles had faced many difficult moments in his life, this one felt especially painful. It wasn't about politics, power, or public image. It was about his family, the people who had made the palace feel human again. The storm had officially begun, even though the palace halls remained silent. The order had been delivered. The guards had drawn their line, and the king, caught between the heart and the crown, had to face the reality of what it meant to wear the weight of tradition on his shoulders. The hours after receiving the letter were some of the longest in King Charles's memory. The palace that had always felt familiar now felt strangely distant. Every hallway he walked through, every familiar face he passed seemed to carry an invisible weight. The decision made by the royal guard was official. It was not a suggestion. It was a step they believed was necessary for the crown. He had faced many difficult decisions in his life, but this one felt different. This wasn't about laws, politics, or international matters. This was personal. This was about the people who sat with him at family dinners, who shared laughter with him on quiet evenings. This was about Camilla's family, the people who had made his world warmer after years of duty and formality. Charles sat in his private study that afternoon, the letter still resting on his desk. Outside, the palace gardens were as beautiful as ever, but the sight gave him no comfort. His thoughts kept circling back to Camilla. How would she feel when she heard the news? She had stood by his side through years of judgment and change. Her family had become a part of his life not through politics but through love and trust. He knew she valued loyalty, and she loved her family deeply. They were her support system, people who reminded her of a simpler world far away from royal expectations. Telling her that the palace was cutting ties with them would be like pulling a thread from a fabric they had carefully woven together over the years. He leaned back in his chair, closing his eyes for a moment. The sound of footsteps echoed faintly in the hallway outside. It was a familiar sound, but today it seemed heavier, like the palace itself knew something had changed. As the afternoon sun poured through the tall windows, Charles' private secretary quietly stepped into the room. "Your Majesty," he said softly, "I know this is difficult." Charles opened his eyes slowly, his face calm but tired. "Difficult?" he repeated quietly, almost as if speaking to himself. "It's more than that. It's personal." The secretary nodded carefully. "The guard believes they are protecting the crown. They think they are doing what's best for the institution." Charles gave a quiet, almost sad smile. "Yes, that's the thing about the crown," he said. "It doesn't feel. It doesn't love. It doesn't cry. But the people who wear it do." For a long time, Charles had accepted the cost of wearing the crown. He knew that he would always have to put duty above desire. But this time, duty was demanding something from his heart, not just from his mind. As evening approached, he finally knew he couldn't delay it any longer. He had to talk to Camilla. She deserved to hear it from him, not from a letter or an advisor. She needed to hear it in his voice, even if that voice trembled. Camilla was in her sitting room reading through a few letters from charities she supported. She looked peaceful, her usual gentle smile resting on her face. When Charles entered the room, she looked up with warmth in her eyes, the same warmth that had carried him through so many stormy moments in life. But she noticed something immediately. His expression was different. He wasn't his usual calm, soft-spoken self. There was something heavy in his eyes. She placed the letters aside and gave him her full attention. "What is it?" she asked softly. Charles sat down across from her, his hands resting together. For a moment, he couldn't find the right words. He looked at her, the woman who had walked beside him through whispers, judgments, and finally acceptance. And now he was about to tell her something that would hurt her deeply. "There's been a decision," he began slowly. His voice was steady but quiet. "It involves your family." Camilla's face softened with confusion. "My family," she repeated. "What kind of decision?" Charles took a deep breath. "The Royal Guard has made a formal recommendation, and it's already been approved." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "They've decided to remove all formal ties between the palace and your family." For a brief moment, Camilla didn't react. The words hung in the air like an invisible weight. Then slowly, the warmth faded from her face, replaced by a quiet shock. "Remove ties?" she asked softly, almost as if she needed to hear it again to believe it. Charles nodded gently. "They believe it's to protect the crown. They say it's about tradition, about keeping the line between the royal family and outside influence clear." Camilla leaned back slightly. She wasn't angry, she was simply stunned. She knew palace life was never easy. She knew there were rules. But she had never imagined that her family would be treated like this. For years they had been respectful, private, and supportive. They never tried to act royal. They only ever came as family. Charles watched her carefully. It broke something inside him to see the hurt slowly appear in her eyes. He reached out, placing his hand gently on hers. "Camilla," he said quietly, "I want you to know this is not my choice. I would never want this." Her fingers tightened slightly around his. "I know," she whispered. "But they've already made up their minds, haven't they?" He didn't need to answer. The silence between them said everything. Camilla looked down at her hands. "They've always seen us differently," she said after a moment. "No matter what I do or how much I try to blend into their world, I will always be the one who came in from the outside. And now they're pushing my family out too." Charles's heart ached at her words. He knew she was right. For all the progress that had been made over the years, there were still walls, invisible walls that the royal system built around itself to keep outsiders at a distance. "You are not an outsider," he said firmly. "Not to me." Camilla lifted her eyes to meet his. There was a softness there, but also pain. "But to them," she said quietly, "I always will be." The room grew quiet. Outside, the palace lights began to glow against the darkening sky. The world beyond the windows carried on as usual, unaware of the storm building inside these walls. Charles squeezed her hand gently. "We will face this together," he promised. "I will speak to them. I will make them understand." But even as he said the words, a part of him knew it wouldn't be easy. The guard did not make such decisions lightly. They believed they were protecting something bigger than anyone's feelings. To change their minds would mean going against years of deeply rooted traditions. Camilla took a deep breath, trying to hold herself together. She wasn't someone who cried easily in public, but this wasn't public. This was their private world. "They've been so kind," she whispered. "My family. They've respected every rule, every boundary. They've never tried to take anything from the palace. All they ever did was love me." Charles nodded. "I know. I've seen it with my own eyes." She looked away for a moment, her voice barely a whisper. "Then why isn't that enough?" He had no answer. That was the hardest part. In many ways, the royal system didn't answer to hearts. It answered to centuries of tradition. And love, no matter how strong, couldn't always change those rules. Charles moved closer, resting his hand gently on her shoulder. "Camilla, I need you to remember something," he said softly. "They can take away titles, access, and privileges. But they can't take away what we have as a family. They can't take away our bond." She nodded slowly, but the sadness didn't leave her eyes. She wasn't just hurt for herself. She was hurt for her family. They had accepted the royal world because they loved her. Now they were being told they didn't belong. The clock on the wall ticked quietly, each second stretching into something longer. For a long time, neither of them spoke. They just sat there, holding each other's hands in silence. Later that night, after Camilla had gone to her room, Charles returned to his study. The letter from the royal guard still sat on his desk. He picked it up and read it again, though every word was already burned into his memory. He thought about the promise he had made to Camilla. To speak to them, to try. But deep down, he knew how strong the system was. It was like trying to move a mountain with his hands. But still, he would try, because this time it wasn't about duty. It was about the people he loved. As the night grew quiet, the palace seemed to settle into its usual calm. But inside those grand walls, something had shifted. A line had been drawn, and the king and queen consort were now standing on opposite sides of tradition and love. The silence in the palace wasn't peaceful anymore. It was the kind of silence that comes just before something important, something that would shape everything that followed. The next morning arrived quietly, but there was a heaviness in the air that was impossible to ignore. The palace, usually filled with its familiar rhythm of daily routines, felt unusually tense. The staff still moved through the corridors, the guards still stood straight at the gates, and the bells still rang at the same hour. But beneath the surface, there was a feeling that something important was about to happen. Charles had hardly slept that night. He had spent hours in his study, walking from one side of the room to the other. The letter from the royal guard sat on his desk, its words echoing in his mind like a quiet but constant reminder of the decision he could not escape. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Camilla's face from the night before. The quiet hurt, the stunned expression, the disbelief. It wasn't just pain in her eyes. It was a kind of silent heartbreak. The king had faced many complicated situations in his life, but this felt different. This wasn't about political matters or foreign affairs. This was about love, trust, and the thin wall between the heart and tradition. He had grown up in a world where duty came first. But this time, duty had walked straight into his personal life and left a mark that couldn't be ignored. When the morning sun began to shine through the tall palace windows, Charles finally decided that he couldn't remain silent. The guard had made their decision, but he was still the king. And even if he couldn't change everything, he needed to speak. He needed to stand up, not as a symbol, but as a man who cared deeply about the people he loved. He called for an urgent meeting. The senior advisors and representatives from the royal guard were summoned. The meeting was set to be held in one of the most private chambers of the palace, a room used only when something truly important was at stake. Meanwhile, Camilla woke up to the sound of birds outside her window. The sky was clear, but her heart felt heavy. She hadn't slept well either. She kept replaying Charles's words in her mind as if hoping that somehow she had misunderstood. But she hadn't. The palace really was cutting ties with her family. The people she loved most outside those royal walls were being quietly pushed away. She sat at her dressing table, looking at her reflection in the mirror. She had worn many expressions over the years, calm, gracious, supportive. But today she felt something else entirely. She felt the quiet ache of being reminded that no matter how close she stood to the throne, she was still different in the eyes of those who guarded its traditions. She knew Charles loved her deeply, but she also knew the weight that sat on his shoulders. It was a weight no one else in the world could fully understand. She didn't want to make him choose between her and the crown. But a part of her wished that, just once, the crown could bend just a little and for love. Back in the private chamber, the senior officials began to gather. There was no fanfare, no grand entrance. This was not a public matter. It was quiet and serious. The walls of the room were lined with portraits of past monarchs. They seemed to watch every move, a reminder of the legacy that had lasted for centuries. Charles entered the room slowly, his expression firm, but calm. His private secretary stood by the door, silent. The senior officer of the Royal Guard and a few senior advisors were already seated around the long table. They stood up respectfully as the king took his seat at the head. For a moment there was silence. Everyone knew why they were there. The air was thick with formality, but beneath that formality was tension. Charles looked at each of them carefully before speaking. "I understand why this decision was made," he began, his voice steady but filled with quiet strength. "I understand the role you play in protecting the crown. I respect it deeply, but I must also speak as a man, not just a monarch." The head of the guard leaned forward slightly. "Your Majesty," he said carefully, "our only goal is to ensure the crown remains protected. This isn't about emotion. It's about the structure that has kept this institution strong for centuries." "I know," Charles replied softly, "but sometimes in protecting something, we forget that it's people who give it meaning. The crown is not just metal. It is carried by human hearts, and my heart is deeply connected to the people you've chosen to push away." His words were gentle, but they carried weight. Everyone in the room felt the difference between a king speaking formally and a man speaking honestly. An advisor cleared his throat softly. "We are not questioning their goodness, Your Majesty, but history has shown that personal closeness with outside families can create complications. Our concern is not them as individuals, but the precedent it sets." Charles listened carefully, then nodded slowly. "I have lived long enough to know how this palace works. I know how tradition stands tall. But I've also learned something else. If tradition becomes a wall that keeps kindness and warmth out, then it begins to lose its meaning. My family is not a threat to the crown. They have never asked for power, never overstepped. They've simply loved Camilla, and by extension me." The room was still. For a brief moment, even the sound of footsteps outside faded away. The head of the guard lowered his voice. "We understand your feelings, Your Majesty. But this decision was not made lightly. Once an order like this is given, reversing it can be difficult." Charles leaned forward slightly, his eyes calm but firm. "Then let it be difficult," he said softly. "Let it be difficult, but not impossible. I am not asking for special treatment. I'm asking for fairness. My wife's family should not be punished for loving her." There was something about the way he spoke, not with anger, but with quiet dignity, that made even the most formal officials shift slightly in their chairs. For a moment, they weren't just listening to a king, they were listening to a human being. Camilla, meanwhile, had quietly made her way toward the chamber. She hadn't been officially called to the meeting, but she knew it was happening. She moved down the corridor slowly, her heels making soft sounds against the floor. She stopped near the door, not stepping in but close enough to hear the calm but intense conversation inside. She heard Charles's voice, steady, warm, protective. She knew he was standing up for her and her family. A part of her felt deeply moved. Another part of her worried about the cost. Inside, one of the advisors spoke again. "Your Majesty, we understand your love and respect for the Queen Consort's family, but the monarchy has survived for so long because it draws clear lines. If we blur those lines, it may weaken the trust people place in the crown." Charles shook his head gently. "Trust isn't built by drawing walls. Trust is built by showing humanity. People look at us not only for strength, but for heart. If we can't treat our own family with respect, how can we ask the public to trust us?" The room fell silent again. These were not the usual words spoken in these halls. They were personal, emotional, and honest. Finally, the senior officer of the Royal Guard spoke. "We will review the order, Your Majesty. But we must be clear. Changing it will take time and careful thought." "That is all I ask," Charles said quietly. "Time and thought. Not cold decisions made in the shadows. These are real people, and their hearts matter." The meeting slowly came to an end. The officials stood and bowed slightly before leaving the chamber. The guard did not promise to reverse the decision completely, but something had changed. The firm wall of formality had been shaken, even if just a little. As the room emptied, Camilla stepped inside quietly. Charles turned when he heard the soft sound of the door closing. She looked at him, her eyes glistening softly, not from tears of sadness but from emotion. "I heard you," she said gently. "I heard everything." He walked toward her slowly. "I couldn't just sit back," he replied softly. "You and your family matter to me, more than they will ever fully understand." Camilla took his hand in hers, holding it tightly. "I never wanted you to fight battles because of me," she whispered. He smiled softly, though his eyes were tired. "It's not because of you. It's because of us. Because some things are worth standing for, even when the walls are high." For a moment, they simply stood there, hand in hand, surrounded by the weight of centuries-old traditions. Outside, the palace was as quiet as ever. But inside this small moment, something real and human was shining through. The guard had made their order, but the king had made his stand. And even though the outcome wasn't certain yet, a door that had been closed too firmly had been pushed open, if only slightly. Camilla rested her head gently against his shoulder. "Whatever happens," she said softly, "I know you tried, and that means everything." Charles wrapped his arm around her gently, drawing strength from the closeness they shared. The crown might have rules, but love had its own language, quiet, strong, and steady. The palace returned to its usual routine, but for those who had been inside that room, the day carried a different weight. A king had spoken not just as a monarch, but as a man with a heart. And sometimes that is enough to change the air around even the oldest walls. The days that followed were quiet, but they carried a kind of calm tension that everyone inside the palace could feel. Nothing dramatic happened on the outside, no loud arguments, no big announcements. But beneath the surface, important conversations were unfolding. Decisions like this didn't change overnight, especially in a place where tradition had stood strong for centuries. For Charles, every day felt heavier than usual. His morning meetings with officials seemed longer, his formal duties felt colder, and even the palace itself seemed quieter. He went about his responsibilities with his usual grace, but the weight on his heart never really left. At night he would return to his study, where that same letter from the royal guard still sat folded neatly on his desk. He hadn't thrown it away, but he hadn't locked it up either. It was a reminder, not of power, but of what power could cost. Camilla carried herself with her usual dignity, but there was something softer, more reflective in her manner. She had spent years learning to live between two worlds, her private life and the royal world. She had learned how to smile even when she felt unsure, how to remain graceful even when the world was watching too closely. But this time the pain was personal. It wasn't a headline. It wasn't public opinion. It was about her family, the people who loved her without titles or crowns. She had not complained, not once. But Charles saw the quiet sadness in her eyes. He saw it in the way she looked out of the window longer than usual, in the way her laughter came slower than before. She never said it aloud, but he knew she missed the simple feeling of her family being welcomed without hesitation. One evening, a small family dinner had been planned at their private residence. Not inside the palace walls, but at one of the royal homes where they could simply be themselves. It wasn't a grand affair. There would be no press, no formal speeches, just a dinner. Camilla's family was invited, and they accepted with warmth, though they too could feel the shift that had taken place. The dinner that night was warm and quiet. The table was set with simple flowers, candles, and soft lights that made the room glow gently. Camilla's sister greeted her with a smile, though it carried a hint of worry. Her children and grandchildren hugged her tightly, their love untouched by royal rules. Charles joined them with a smile that was real, not practiced. For a little while, the palace walls and all their traditions felt far away. For a little while, they were just a family sharing a meal, laughing softly, telling stories, and remembering what truly mattered. At one point, Charles looked around the table. He saw Camilla laughing gently with her sister, her grandchildren sharing stories from school, and the warmth in their faces as they spoke to one another. It was a simple moment, but it filled the room with something no royal event ever could: genuine love. He thought about the guard's order, the meeting, the rules. And then he looked at these people who had never once asked to be royal. They had only ever wanted to be a family. It made him realize once again how far apart the royal world and the real world could sometimes be. A few days later, the royal guard presented their review to the king. The meeting was scheduled early in the morning. The same officials who had delivered the decision were seated around the same table. There was less tension this time, but the weight of the moment was still there. The senior officer spoke carefully. "Your Majesty," he began, "we have considered your words. We understand the emotion behind this matter. While the institution must always protect its structure, we also acknowledge your position as both king and a man with a family." Charles listened intently. His hands folded calmly. The officer continued, "We cannot fully reverse the decision that has been made. The crown must keep a certain boundary to preserve tradition, but we are prepared to allow certain exceptions. Camilla's family will retain their personal privileges. They will be welcomed at private gatherings and personal family events. Their place in your personal life will not be interfered with." Charles nodded slowly. He understood the careful language. It wasn't everything he wanted, but it was something. The guard would not fully open the door, but they were no longer closing it completely either. It was a delicate compromise. The royal world would maintain its formal structure, but his personal world, the one that mattered to his heart, would remain intact. The advisor added, "We ask that these visits remain personal and private, not tied to official royal duties." Charles gave a quiet smile. "That's all they've ever wanted," he said softly. "To be part of my life, not part of the crown." As the meeting ended, there was a different feeling in the room. No one celebrated. That wasn't how things worked in the palace. But something had shifted. It wasn't a complete victory, but it was a gentle step toward balance. When Charles told Camilla later that day, she listened carefully. She didn't interrupt him. She simply let his words settle in her heart. "They've agreed to let things be," he explained softly. "They'll respect the personal side of our lives. Your family can still be with us in the ways that matter most. They're not shutting them out completely." For a moment she said nothing. Then a slow, warm smile spread across her face. It wasn't a loud smile or one filled with celebration. It was quiet and genuine, the kind of smile that comes when a weight has finally been lifted, even just a little. "Thank you," she whispered. Charles reached for her hand. "I did it for us," he said, "because love shouldn't have to stay behind walls." The following week, Camilla's family visited again. It was a sunny afternoon, the kind of day where the sky seemed too blue to belong to a place filled with old rules. The gardens were blooming and laughter echoed softly through the air. There were no cameras, no stiff introductions, just family walking together, sharing moments. The guards stood at a distance, respectful but less rigid. They were still doing their job, but something in their faces had softened too. They had seen the king stand up not with anger but with quiet strength. And that had left a mark. Camilla walked beside Charles through the garden path. Her grandchildren ran ahead, their laughter filling the air like music. Her sister was talking to one of the staff, thanking them politely as always. It all looked ordinary, but to them it was extraordinary. Charles looked at Camilla with a soft smile. "Do you hear that?" he asked. Camilla tilted her head. "What?" "The sound of life," he said quietly. "The sound of a home." For so many years the palace had been a symbol of power and duty, but in that moment it felt like something else, a place where love could quietly breathe even if it had to live between rules and traditions. Camilla leaned closer to him. "You made this happen," she said softly. "No," he replied gently. "We made this happen by holding on to what matters." In the days that followed, the topic slowly faded from the daily discussions of the advisors. It became something that belonged to the quiet side of palace life. Not the headlines, not the protocols, just a personal corner of the king and queen consort's world. The guards still followed their duties. The palace still stood as proud and formal as it always had. But now, inside those walls, there was a small but meaningful space where love and family were allowed to exist without fear of being erased. Charles knew he had not changed the system. No one could change centuries of tradition in one moment, but he had reminded those around him, and perhaps even himself, that behind the gold, the titles and the history, there were real people with real hearts. One evening, after the sun had set and the palace had grown quiet again, Charles stood by the window, looking out at the lights in the garden. Camilla joined him, resting her head gently on his shoulder. "Do you feel it?" he asked softly. She nodded. "Yes, it's peaceful." He wrapped his arm around her. "For the first time in days," he said, "it feels like the palace is breathing again." Camilla closed her eyes, letting the moment settle. The decision may not have been fully reversed, but they had kept their family close. That in itself was a quiet victory. The crown would always be heavy. Duty would always come with rules. But love had found its space. Small, maybe, but strong. And sometimes that's all it takes to change a story.